Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the subjectivity of literature, bound up in mysticism, open up the discussion of promoting queer rights and identity to the realm of literary discussion. This has room in a literature or history class, but is ultimately a terrible strategy for the movement to have to prioritize. This debate is specifically about what they need to be able to do, especially since, in terms of resources, time, and human capacity, they are very limited. And given the intersectionality of the movement, given multiple strands, and in many instances, certain degrees of infighting, it's terrible and ultimately a problem-solution mismatch. A few key points of framing which I think are relevant to this debate that also serve as substantive material. Number one, this is an actor motion of the queer community, but we need to be able to look at this from the lens of the collective and as individual people. That is to say, institutional leaders or key opinion leaders in terms of being able to lock in on a strategy given the intersectionality that I mentioned in my pre-oration. There are three sub-points under this. A, people within the movement who we have to be able to take care of given the huge amount of diversity and in many instances a strong push from the conservative right and the radical left. These are the people who we need to be able to involve in discussions and not just dilute this into the realm of literature and mysticism, something that both of these extremes might not even be privy to given that they might not be as religiously or culturally aware. B, people outside the movement, allies and other people we have to gain the support from in order to be able to lobby against structural reform. That is to say, legislative and economic barriers set up by politicians, set up by the patriarchy, and other conservative institutions who weaponize and use religion and not necessarily culture or history as a means to be able to lock in these queer people in their own despise. C, closet queers and individuals or trans persons who are moderate and unsure about themselves who we want to be able to help. Number two, what is the consequence of prioritizing these local myths and why is it a bad strategy? A, as what the POI suggests, and this is me co-opting it, this is largely bound up in regional myths and legend through literature, whether it be Greek, Norse, or of indigenous people. This ultimately is few and far between, and many people in itself are not aware about it. Maybe they heard it in class, but the way it manifests itself to be able to arrive at the conclusion of, oh bro, those guys, they were gay. Oh, that person, they were bi and they were trans. Even if these people are now aware of it, which is the case coming from the Prime Minister, it opens it up to a lot of discourse and reinterpretation, which ultimately make it a deadlock and up to the realms of literary subjectivity of who can write a longer and better term paper or who can give a better debate speech about it. That is to say, you're scrutinizing the wrong thing because ultimately it's like, wait, is that thing canon? No, bro, it's just some bullshit offshoot fan fiction, which is ultimately a terrible strategy to latch onto. The second part about this is that it's not necessarily a tipping point, especially when it comes to the plight of the queer community. That is to say, we need to be able to look at the very real plights of particular individuals to be able to understand if this is an appropriate or valid strategy. That is to say, we need to be able to lock in on these shithole conservative patriarchal people who do things like say, being gay is not okay, it is not legitimate, the state won't look at that, you cannot get a gender reconstruction kind of surgery, you cannot do PDA, heterosexuality is the way to go. Number three, and quite importantly, what is our comparative? What would we rather prioritize? And this is a round-winning case. We think we want to be able to prioritize the very visceral, legitimate, and grassroots stories of people who exist in the spectrum. Let's say you're a gay, homosexual man raised in a Catholic regime. You're a lesbian who was in the closet for far too long and are now in a liberal society wherein things work out in your side of the world so they can be able to learn the best and worst from each other's stories. We can even talk about the very people within transition, a huge part of the movement. bisexual people who are looking at either becoming homosexual or even transitioning, for example, to potentially becoming trans. These are the very real stories we have to be able to listen to. And this debate is about priority, meaning on our side, we can have a low-hanging fruit of talking about these legends and myths, but I think the true tipping point, to respond to the previous speaker, is in terms of those things. The heart of our extension that I've talked to you about is really the theme of really talking about what change we want. How do we best reach the interest of the particular movement in order to challenge these very real and valid structural limitations, and on their comparative, why it's a terrible kind of strategy, even if people are aware. The first thing I have to say is that it undermines the progress you've already made because it deludes it in the realm of subjectivity. There are going to be conservative literary analysts and people who are going to challenge that and say it's not canon, it's fanfic. And sure, even if the previous speaker responded to the POI by saying more perspectives are better, and they try to set this debate and say, bruh, it's only going to be in those like minorities and indigenous communities who we want to take part of. My question is, and this is a flip of what opening government says, if these people are already aware of these things, then why do we have to prioritize it even more? These minorities and indigenous communities are important. They are a legitimate strand. But if we want to have a true strategy that is able to encapsulate that intersectionality, we don't want to highlight those fringe differences, Mr. Speaker, and drown it in the realm of literary subjectivity. The harm is far too great, and ultimately, on their side of the house, even if you're motivated to have this cultural protection, etc., then have a museum. Let's represent those particular artists or those particular people and tell the stories of that community, as opposed to taking away the attention from them and putting it on people who don't exist. Literal figures in belief who are ultimately not necessarily even religious in nature, but ultimately a part of subjective norms of culture. And for all of these reasons, we think it's a terrible strategy. We are proud to stand on side negative. Thank you.